on the 28th of April, 1945. Hauptmann Klaus Becker crouched in the rubble of what had once been a Lutheran church in eastern Berlin. Listening to the thunder of Soviet artillery growing closer with each passing hour, the acrid smell of cordite and burning timber filled his nostrils as he watched his remaining 23 males, really, most no older than 17, huddle against the shattered walls. The Third Reich was dying, and Klaus knew it. What he did not know was that his war was far from over. Klaus had been a soldier for 6 years, since 1939, when he marched into Poland as a freshly commissioned lieutenant filled with the Reich's propaganda and youthful conviction. Now, at 31 years old, he was a different man entirely. The Eastern Front had stripped away every illusion. He had seen things at Stalingrad, at Kursk, at Warsaw that would haunt him until his final breath. The retreat westward had been chaos incarnate, tired divisions dissolving, command structures collapsing, men deserting by the thousands. His orders were absurd. Hold this sector of Berlin until relieved. Relieved by whom? The mythical armies that Goebbels promised on the radio. Klaus had stopped believing in miracles somewhere between the Vistula and the Oder rivers. The youngest of his men, a boy named Werner Hoffmann from Bavaria, approached with trembling hands clutching a near-empty ammunition box. Herr Hauptmann, we have perhaps 3 magazines per man remaining, and the water, ... double quotes. Klaus raised his hand. I know, Werner, I know. Through a gap in the masonry, Klaus could see Soviet tanks, the dreaded T-34s grinding through the streets 2 blocks away. Infantry followed in their wake, moving with the confidence of victors according to fragmentary reports from Command. If command even still existed, over 2 million Soviet troops were converging on Berlin. Against them stood old men, children, and shattered remnants of units like his own. As night fell on that April evening, Klaus made his decision. He gathered his men in the church's cellar, their faces illuminated by a single candle stub. Gentlemen, he began, using a term that seemed almost laughable given their filthy uniforms and hollow eyes. The war is lost. Anyone who tells you otherwise is either a liar or a fool. We have 2 choices. Die here for nothing or attempt to surrender with dignity intact. Several men nodded. Others stared at their boots. Surrender to the Soviets was not a decision made lightly. They had all heard the stories, the reprisals, the forced marches, the camps in Siberia where men simply disappeared. But death was certain if they remained. Obergefreiter Schultz, a veteran who had fought since France in 1940, spoke up. If we surrender, Herr Hauptmann, we do it together. All of us. No one gets left behind. Klaus felt something catch in his throat. These men had become his brothers through blood and suffering. Together, he agreed. At dawn, we display white flags and approach their lines properly. We are soldiers, not criminals. We surrender as soldiers. That night, none of them slept. Klaus wrote a final letter to his wife Margarethe in Hamburg. Hamburg still stood, if she still lived. He had not heard from her in 3 months. The letter would never be sent, but writing it brought small comfort, as the first grey light of April 29th crept through the shattered windows. Klaus Becker prepared to meet his fate. The morning of April 29th, 1945, dawned cold and colourless over Berlin's ruins. Klaus Becker tied a white undershirt to a wooden plank, his hands steadier than he expected. Around him, his men removed their helmets and field equipment, arranging themselves into a semblance of military formation. If they were to surrender, they would do it properly. "Keep your weapons pointed down," Klaus instructed, "hands visible at all times. No sudden movements. These men have fought across half of Europe to reach Berlin. They will shoot first and ask questions never. If we give them reason, they emerged from the church into a landscape of utter devastation." Berlin, once the proud capital of the Reich, had been transformed into something resembling the surface of the moon. Entire city blocks had been reduced to hills of brick and twisted metal. Bodies lay where they had fallen, uncollected, some German, some Soviet, all equally dead. Klaus led his small column forward, the white flag held high. They had traveled perhaps 200 meters when Soviet infantry materialized from behind a collapsed building. At least 30 men, submachine guns raised, shouting in Russian, "Halt! Ruki Verk." The command needed no translation. "Hands up." Klaus and his men complied immediately, dropping to their knees as ordered. Soviet soldiers surrounded them, weapons trained, eyes hard with the kind of hatred earned through 4 years of brutal warfare. One soldier, no older than Werner, spat at Klaus's feet. Another kicked Dieter Schultz in the ribs, sending the older man sprawling. A Soviet officer approached her captain, Klaus judged from his insignia. The man's face bore a long scar from temple to jaw, and his eyes were chips of winter ice. He spoke in broken German, USS 9. Klaus responded quickly. Vermocht Regular Army. Hauptmann Klaus Becker, 3rd Panzer Division. The Soviet captain studied him for a long moment, then barked orders. Soviet soldiers moved through Klaus's men, stripping them of watches, rings, photographs, anything of value. One young Soviet soldier paused over a photograph of Werner's mother, then surprisingly handed it back to the boy. According to a detailed account later published in the American journal Military History Quarterly in 1997, German posts captured in the final days of Berlin's fall faced wildly varying treatment depending on which Soviet unit captured them and where. Klaus's group was fortunate they were not immediately executed, which had been the fate of many SS officers and suspected war criminals. They were marched eastward through Berlin's devastated streets, part of a growing column of German prisoners. Klaus saw men he recognized from other units, a colonel from the 6th Army, engineers from the 9th, even a Luftwaffe pilot, still in his flight suit, limping badly from a wounded leg. The Soviet guards drove them hard, allowing no rest stops, no water. Men who fell were beaten until they rose or dragged to the roadside and left. By afternoon, Klaus estimated their column numbered 300 prisoners. By evening, perhaps 400. They spent that first night in a bombed-out factory, packed so tightly that sitting was impossible. A Soviet guard threw in 2 buckets of water for 400 men. Men fought each other for a single sip. Klaus managed to cup enough water for Werner, forcing the boy to drink despite his protests. In the darkness, men prayed, wept, or stared into nothing. Dieter Schultz, pressed against Klaus's shoulder, whispered, "We should have fought to the death." "This is no life. We are alive," Klaus replied, though he wondered if he believed it himself. "While we live, there is hope." The next morning, May 1st, the day Hitler committed suicide, though Klaus would not learn this until much later. They marched again, eastward, always eastward, through Mecklenburg and Brandenburg, past endless columns of Soviet troops and equipment moving west, toward the last German holdouts. The journey took 3 weeks. 3 weeks of starvation, rations, watery soup, and black bread and brutal treatment. Men died daily from exhaustion, dysentery, or simple despair. The Soviets buried none of them, leaving bodies beside the road as warnings. But Klaus kept his men together through force of will alone. Each morning, he counted them. Each night, he distributed their meager rations fairly. When Werner contracted dysentery, Klaus gave the boy his own food for 3 days. On May 22nd, they arrived at a Soviet holding camp near Minsk. The Soviet prison camp, designated Stalag 516, stood in a clearing carved from dense Belarusian forest, approximately 15 kilometers west of Minsk, when Klaus Becker first glimpsed it through the morning fog of May 22nd, 1945, his heart sank. The compound consisted of rough-hewn wooden barracks, surrounded by multiple rows of barbed wire, watchtowers every 50 meters, and guards with dogs patrolling the perimeter. It looked less like a prison camp and more like an extermination facility. The Soviets processed them with brutal efficiency. Klaus and his remaining 17 men, 6, had died on the march, were stripped, deloused with harsh chemicals that burned the skin, issued threadbare Soviet uniforms, and assigned to Barracks 14. The building was designed for perhaps 60 men, but housed over 200 men, slept in shifts on crude wooden shelves, 3 tiers high, fighting for space like animals. Klaus learned the camp's rhythms quickly. Wake at 5 in the morning to the sound of whistles and shouted Russian commands. Stand for roll call in all-weather rain, snow, or brutal suns, sometimes 4 hours, while guards counted and recounted. Breakfast was a ladle of thin-grained soup and a chunk of black bread that weighed perhaps 200 grams. Then work details. The Soviets put them to work rebuilding what the Germans had destroyed. Klaus's group was assigned to a brick factory 12 kilometers from camp. Each morning they marched there under guard. Each evening they marched back, exhausted to the point of collapse. The work was back-breaking, hauling bricks, mixing mortar, clearing rubberland. The quotas were impossible. Men who failed to meet quotas received reduced rations, which meant they grew weaker, which meant they failed quotas again, a death spiral that claimed dozens weekly. Obergefriter dieter Schultz proved invaluable. The old soldier had worked construction before the war and knew bricks. He taught the younger men tricks for conserving energy, for appearing to work harder than they were, for meeting just enough of the quota to avoid punishment. Klaus came to rely on him completely. Camp 516 held approximately 8,000 German POs, representing every branch of the Wehrmacht and every region of Germany. Klaus met officers who had commanded divisions, scientists who had worked on rocket programs, factory workers conscripted in 1944. The Soviets made no distinctions. General and private received identical treatment. Disease ravaged the camp. Typhus, dysentery, tuberculosis, pneumonia. Men died daily, sometimes hourly. The Soviets buried them in mass graves beyond the wire, unmarked and unconsecrated. Klaus performed burial duty once, helping to drag 47 bodies to the pits. He never volunteered again. But humans adapt even to hell. By July, Klaus had established a routine. He had learned enough Russian to understand commands and occasionally bargain with guards. He had formed alliances with other prisoners, a former doctor named Heinrich Weber, who could sometimes acquire medicines. A carpenter named Otto Brandt, who could repair things in exchange for food, a linguist named Stefan Meyer, who served as translator during interrogations. The NKVD Soviet secret police conducted interrogations weekly, searching for SS officers, Gestapo agents, war criminals. Klaus was interrogated 3 times. Each session followed the same pattern: hours of questions about his service, demands to confess to atrocities he had not committed, threats of transfer to camps further east where men disappeared forever. Klaus answered truthfully, maintained his dignity, and each time was returned to the barracks. Young Werner Hoffmann struggled most. The boy had been 18 when they surrendered, barely 19 now. He had lost 30 pounds he could not afford to lose, and the hard labor was destroying him. Klaus protected Werner as much as possible, trading his own food, taking Werner's heaviest loads when guards were not watching. On August 6, 1945, the day America dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. Though Klaus would not learn this for months, something changed. The guards' demeanor shifted. More Soviet officers appeared. Whispered rumors spread through the barracks. The war with Japan was ending. The Americans and British were demanding prisoner repatriations. Stalin was making deals. But when Klaus dared to hope for release, older prisoners laughed bitterly. "The Soviets will never release us," said a former colonel named Friedrich Vogel, who had been captured at Stalingrad in 1943. "We are free labor. We will die here." Yet on September 12, everything changed. Klaus was summoned from his work detail, his heart pounding with dread. Summons usually meant interrogation or worse. Instead, he found himself with 20 other men, including Dieter and Werner, facing a Soviet major who read from a list. "You are being transferred. the major announced in German. Gather your possessions. You leave tomorrow. Transferred where? Klaus dared to ask. The major's face betrayed nothing. West
could mean anything in another camp. A trial, execution, but it could also mean Klaus did not let himself hope. Not yet. The morning of September 13th, 1945, dawned with unusual clarity over Stalag 516. Klaus Becker stood with his meager possessions, a spare undershirt, spoon carved from wood, a stub of pencil, and 3 precious scraps of paper, watching as Soviet guards organized approximately 200 German prisoners into columns. The selection process had been mysterious. The men who had been in the camp since 1943 were chosen. Others, including Klaus's group, had arrived only months before. No pattern was apparent. Maybe they are sorting us by crimes, Werner whispered nervously. Maybe they know things we do not. Dieter Schultz spat into the dust. They know nothing. This is Soviet bureaucracy, random and meaningless. We go where we are sent and hope it is better than here. The guards loaded them onto freight trains, the same type the Germans had once used to transport Soviet prisoners eastward, a bitter irony not lost on Klaus. 60 men per car, wooden slat walls, a single bucket for waste, no seats or beds. The doors were slid shut and locked from outside. The train lurched into motion, with a screech of metal on metal. Through gaps in the wooden slats, Klaus watched the Belarusian forest slide past. They traveled for what felt like days' time, became meaningless in the dark, stifling freight car. The Soviets stopped occasionally to distribute bread and water through small openings, never enough of either. Men relieved themselves in the bucket, which overflowed and sloshed across the floor, adding to the misery. Some men had been doctors, teachers, engineers. Now they huddled in their own filth, wondering if they were being transported to freedom or simply a different kind of death. Klaus led them in organizing shifts, some men standing while others sat, rotating every few hours. It was the only way to prevent men from being trampled or suffocated. On the 4th day, the train stopped for longer than usual. Klaus pressed his eye to a gap in the slats and saw Soviet soldiers speaking with what appeared to be American soldiers. His heart leaped. The Americans wore different uniforms, carried different weapons. Could this be the transfer the Soviet major had mentioned? The doors slid open, flooding the car with painful daylight. An American captain stood outside, young and clean in pressed uniform, flanked by Soviet officers. He surveyed the freight car's interior with barely concealed shock. Jesus Christ, the American muttered in English. Stefan Meyer, pressed beside Klaus, translated quietly. According to records later declassified and referenced in the 1993 book, Prisoners of Peace, Soviet-American POW exchanges after World War II, by historian Margaret Fisher, approximately 15,000 German prisoners were transferred from Soviet to American custody between September and December 1945 as part of complex repatriation negotiations. These prisoners represented various categories: men captured in western sectors but transported east, prisoners the Soviets deemed low priority, and some whose transfers served diplomatic purposes Klaus would never fully understand. The American captain spoke to his Soviet counterpart in halting Russian, then turned to address the prisoners in German. I am Captain Robert Morrison, United States Army. You are being transferred to American custody. You will be transported to a processing center in Bavaria. Follow all instructions. Anyone who attempts to escape will be shot. Bavaria, Western Germany, American custody. The words seemed almost too good to be true. The transfer process took hours. American and Soviet officials checked names against lists, argued over discrepancies, made notations in multiple languages. Klaus and his men stood in formation, barely daring to breathe. When Klaus's name was finally called, he stepped forward, certain some mistake would be discovered, that he would be pulled aside and returned to Soviet control. But he was not. He was directed to a different train, an actual passenger train, with seats where American soldiers distributed real food, white bread, canned meat, even chocolate. Werner wept when he bit into the chocolate bar. Dieter simply stared at his portion as though it might vanish. The train journey westward took 3 days, but these were 3 days of relative comfort. The Americans allowed them to wash, provided blankets, even permitted them to look out the windows without fear. Klaus watched as the landscape changed from destroyed Soviet territories to war-torn Poland, to finally, miraculously, Germany. but not his Germany. Not the Germany he had left in 1939. They passed through cities that no longer existed. Leipzig was rubble, Dresden was moonscape, Nuremberg was skeletal remains. The Reich had been utterly annihilated. On September 19th, the train arrived at a facility outside Munich, designated Prisoner of War Enclosure 77. Unlike the Soviet camp, this place had actual buildings, organized streets, medical facilities. American flags flew everywhere. Klaus and his men were processed, fingerprinted, photographed, interrogated. A shocking realization dawned. They were not exactly free, but they were no longer in Soviet hands. The Americans treated them firmly, but without the casual brutality of the Soviets. They asked questions about war crimes, but seemed to actually listen to answers. Klaus was assigned to Barracks 23 with Dieter and Werner. That night, lying on an actual cot with an actual mattress, Werner asked, "Are we prisoners, or are we saved?" Klaus considered the question. Both, perhaps. But we are alive and we are together. For now, that is enough. Prisoner of War Enclosure 77 sprawled across what had been a Wehrmacht training facility before the war, located 15 kilometers northeast of Munich. When Klaus Becker first surveyed it properly in daylight on September 20th, 1945, he counted approximately 30 wooden barracks, each housing 100 men. Surrounded by a single fence knot, the multiple layers of barbed wire the Soviets had employed. American guards patrolled, but they carried their rifles loosely, almost casually. The entire atmosphere was different. The Americans organized the camp with characteristic efficiency. Each barracks elected a spokesman who liaised with camp administration. Work details were voluntary, though those who worked received extra rations and small payments in camp scrip that could be used at a canteen. Medical care was available, actual doctors with actual medicines. There was even a library stocked with German books and a recreation area where men could play chess or football. After 4 months in Soviet captivity, it felt like paradise. But it was still prison. Klaus was interrogated extensively during his first week. American intelligence officers wanted detailed information about his service record, particularly his time on the Eastern Front. They asked about atrocities he might have witnessed, commanders he had served under, operations he had participated in. Klaus answered truthfully he had nothing to hide. He had been a soldier, not an executioner. He had fought battles, not murdered civilians. The interrogating officer, a Major Thomas Fletcher from Illinois, who had studied German history at university, seemed satisfied. "Captain Becker," Fletcher said on their final session, "using Klaus's Wehrmacht rank, you are being classified as a standard POW, not a war criminal. You will remain here until repatriation procedures are completed. Could be months, could be longer. Cooperate, stay out of trouble, and you will eventually go home." Home. The word felt strange. Where was home? Hamburg, where his wife Margarete had lived if she still lived. He had written letters through the Red Cross, but received no responses. He did not know if his home still stood, if his family still breathed. Germany itself was divided now, occupied by 4 powers. The country he had fought for no longer existed. Camp life settled into routine. Klaus volunteered for the work detail at the camp warehouse, inventorying supplies. It was easy work, kept him occupied, and provided extra rations. Dieter found work in the carpentry shop, repairing furniture for camp administration. Werner, still weak from his Soviet ordeal, was assigned to lighter duties in the camp kitchen. Through the autumn and winter of 1945, Klaus learned the full scope of Germany's destruction. Newspapers in the camp library, German-language editions published under American supervision, reported the Nuremberg trials, the division of Germany, the magnitude of the Holocaust. This last revelation shocked even veteran soldiers. Klaus had known vaguely about concentration camps, about persecution of Jews, but the systematic industrial murder of 6 million people was beyond comprehension. Many prisoners refused to believe it. Allied propaganda, they insisted. Others, like Klaus, read the testimony of camp survivors, saw the photographs from Dachau and Bergen-Belsen, and felt sick. Whatever they had fought for, it had led to this. In December, Klaus received his first letter from Germany. Not from Margarete, but from her sister Anna, who lived in Bremen. The envelope was thin, the paper poor quality, but the words were precious. "Dear Klaus, I write with heavy heart. Margaretti and the children were killed in the firestorm bombing of July 43. The entire neighborhood burned. They did not suffer, Anna. Klaus read the letter 3 times before its meaning penetrated. Margaretti dead. His children, Elizabeth, age 8, and young Klaus, age 5, dead. For 2 years, he had been writing letters to corpses, holding hope for ashes. He folded the letter carefully and placed it in his pocket. He walked to the latrine, locked himself in a stall, and wept silently for 20 minutes. Then he washed his face, returned to his barracks, and told no one. What was there to say? Half the men in camp had lost everything. But something broke inside Klaus that December day. The war had taken everything: his country, his family, his faith in humanity. He was 32 years old and had nothing. Dieter found him that evening sitting alone in the recreation area, staring at a chessboard without moving the pieces. The older man sat down across from him and waited. Finally, Klaus spoke. They are dead.
All of them?
Dieter needed no clarification. I know, he said quietly. My wife and son died at Cologne. 44 bombing. They sat in silence as darkness fell. 2 soldiers who had survived everything the war could throw at them, now facing a loss that bullets and bombs could never inflict. We keep living, Dieter said eventually. That is what we do. We keep living because they cannot. We owe them that. Klaus nodded, though he was not certain he believed it. Spring came to Camp 77 in 1946. The Americans began releasing prisoners in batches, starting with those from the American occupation zone who had homes to return to. Klaus, whose address in Hamburg placed him in the British zone, waited and waited. Months passed. Summer arrived. Werner was released in June, tearfully promising to write. Dieter left in August, heading to his sister's farm in Bavaria. One by one, the men Klaus had surrendered with, had marched with, had survived with, departed. Klaus remained. On the morning of October 3rd, 1946, 18 months after Germany's surrender, Klaus Becker was summoned to the camp administration building. He had been summoned before routine paperwork checks, updated interrogations about former comrades, processing for eventual release, but something about this felt different. The American corporal who delivered the message seemed unusually formal, and 2 officers Klaus did not recognize waited outside the building. Inside the office, Major Fletcher sat behind a desk, but he was not alone. Beside him sat a civilian, perhaps 50 years old, wearing an expensive suit despite the post-war shortages. The man had intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles and the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. Sit down, Captain Becker, Fletcher said, gesturing to a chair. This is Mr. William Harrison from the State Department. He has a proposition for you. Klaus sat, his mind racing. State Department meant American government. But why would American government officials care about a German POW awaiting repatriation? Harrison spoke in fluent German, which was somehow more unsettling than if he had used English. Captain Becker, we have reviewed your file extensively. Your service record, your interrogation transcripts, your conduct in this camp. Everything suggests you are a man of integrity who served his country but committed no war crimes. Klaus said nothing. Praise from Americans felt like a trap. Harrison continued. We are establishing a new intelligence service in Germany, primarily focused on the Soviet threat. We need men who know the Soviets, how they think, how they operate, their military capabilities. You spent 4 months in Soviet captivity. You speak some Russian. You understand their methods. We want to recruit you. The words hung in the air like smoke. Klaus struggled to process them. You want me to spy for America? We want you to provide intelligence, analysis, and eventually field work in the Soviet occupation zone, Harrison corrected. You would be employed by the United States Army, receive a salary, and eventually be granted American citizenship if you desire it. Klaus felt dizzy. I am a German soldier. How can I work for the nation that defeated Germany? Fletcher leaned forward. Germany lost, Captain. That is reality. Now there is a new threat: Stalin's Soviet Union. The Russians are consolidating control over Eastern Europe, developing nuclear weapons, threatening Western democracy. We defeated Nazi Germany together, Americans and Soviets. Now that alliance is fracturing. The question is, which side of this new conflict do you want to be on? According to the book The Secret War, America's Shadow Warriors in Post-War Germany by journalist David Keller. Published in 2008. American intelligence services recruited over 3,000 former Wehrmacht officers between 1946 and 1952 serve in various capacities against the Soviet Union. Some provided technical expertise on Soviet military equipment. Others, like Klaus, would become operated in denied areas gathering human intelligence. The program, initially controversial, proved invaluable during the early Cold War years. Klaus's mind reeled. Everything in him resisted. He had sworn an oath to Germany, to the Wehrmacht. But what was that oath worth now? Germany was occupied, divided, destroyed. The Wehrmacht no longer existed. The Soviets. Klaus remembered the camps, the brutality, the casual disregard for human life. With the Soviets dominated Europe, what kind of world would that create? What would this work entail? Klaus asked carefully. Harrison pulled out a folder. Initially, analysis work. You would be brought to our facility in Pullack near Munich and help us understand Soviet military doctrine. Camp systems, interrogation techniques based on your experiences. Later, if you prove capable and willing, infiltration operations. We need men who can pass as German civilians in the Soviet zone, gather intelligence, recruit assets, and if I refuse, you will be released through normal repatriation channels within the next few months, Fletcher said. You will return to Hamburg or what remains of it with no job, no prospects, in a country that will take decades to rebuild. Captain, this is purely voluntary. Klaus sat back. It was an impossible decision, yet somehow it was also easy. What did he have to return to? Margarethi was dead. His children were dead. His home was likely rubble. Germany was a corpse being picked over by vultures, working for the Americans against his former Soviet captors. There was a kind of justice in that, a kind of purpose. If I agree, Klaus said slowly, I have conditions. 2 Manobergifferter, Dieter, Schultz, and Private Werner Hoffmann. They were with me through everything. If they are willing, they come too. Harrison consulted with Fletcher in whispered English, then nodded. We can arrange that, assuming they pass security screening. Klaus took a deep breath. He was about to cross a line from which there was no return, and I accept. Harrison smiled, a cold professional smile. Oh, welcome to the organization, Captain Becker. Or should I say Agent Becker? 3 days later, Klaus left Camp 77 in a U.S. Army sedan, watching in the rearview mirror as the only home he had known for over a year disappeared. He was no longer a prisoner, but he was not exactly free either. He had simply traded one form of service for another. The question was whether this service would finally provide the purpose that the war had stripped away, or whether it would destroy what little remained of his soul. The sedan drove south toward Munich, toward his new life, toward secrets and shadows. Klaus Becker, the German soldier, was dead. Someone new was being born. The facility at Pullack sat hidden behind high walls and thick trees, approximately 20 kilometers south of Munich. When Klaus Becker arrived on October 7, 1946, the main building a former Nazi administrative complex had been scrubbed of all swastika imagery, but retained an unmistakably German architecture. Armed American guards checked his credentials at 3 separate gates before allowing entry. Whatever operation the Americans were running here, they took security seriously. Harrison led Klaus through sterile hallways to a small office where paperwork awaited. Klaus signed documents he barely understood, written in English with cursory German translations. Non-disclosure agreements, employment contracts, security clearances, acknowledgments that he could be executed for treason if he betrayed American interests. Each signature felt like a nail in the coffin of his old life. Your German military rank means nothing here, Harrison explained. You are a civilian contractor now, though for operational purposes, we will maintain the fiction that you are an American Army intelligence analyst. Your codename is Granite. Use it in all official communications. Granite, Klaus almost laughed, felt anything but solid. The training program began immediately. Klaus was joined by 12 other former Wehrmacht officers, all recruited under similar circumstances. Some Klaus recognized from Camp 77. Others came from British or French custody. They were all men who had lost everything and had nowhere else to go. The Americans paired each recruit with a handler, an experienced intelligence officer who would oversee their development. Klaus was assigned to Captain James Morrison, a sharp-eyed veteran of the Office of Strategic Services who had parachuted into occupied France during the war. Morrison spoke excellent German and had little patience for nonsense. "You are not soldiers anymore," Morrison told the recruits on their first morning. "Soldiers follow orders, fight battles, win wars. You are going to be intelligence operatives. It means you lie, you manipulate, you betray. You live in gray areas where right and wrong become meaningless. If you cannot handle that, leave now." The training was comprehensive and brutal. They learned tradecraft, how to detect surveillance, how to run surveillance, how to communicate covertly using dead drops and brush passes. They learned interrogation techniques, both as interrogator and interrogated. They memorized details about Soviet military structure, political hierarchy, and security services. Klaus excelled at the work. His experience in Soviet captivity gave him insights others lacked. He understood how Soviet soldiers thought, how their command structures functioned, how to exploit the fear that permeated every level of Soviet society. Morrison noted this in his evaluations. They also learned languages. Klaus's Russian was rudimentary, so he spent 4 hours daily with a white Russian émigré named Alexei, who drilled him mercilessly on vocabulary, grammar, and idioms. By December, Klaus could hold basic conversations. By February of 1947, he could pass for someone who had spent time in the Soviet zone. The physical training was less intensive than Wehrmacht standards, but more focused. They learned how to move silently, how to climb buildings, how to escape restraints, how to kill quickly and quietly with hands, knives, or improvised weapons. Klaus had killed men in combat, but this was different, cold, calculated, intimate. Werner Hoffmann arrived at Pulak in late November, having accepted the Americans' offer. The young man had gained back some weight, but still carried the haunted look of someone who had seen too much too young. He was assigned a different handler and training group, but Klaus made sure they saw each other regularly. Dieter Schultz took longer to locate. He had been released to his sister's farm and was initially reluctant to return to any kind of military or intelligence service. But the farm was failing, food was scarce, and the Americans offered steady pay. He arrived in January of 1947, grumbling about working for the enemy, but secretly relieved to have purpose again. By spring of 1947, Klaus had completed basic training. Morrison informed him that his first operational assignment would come soon. Klaus would be infiltrated into the Soviet Zone Est Germany undercover as a displaced person seeking work. His mission was simple: gather intelligence on Soviet military installations, identify potential recruitment targets among German civilians, and report back. "This is real, Becker," Morrison warned during their final pre-deployment briefing. "If the Soviets catch you, they will not treat you as a prisoner of war. They will consider you a spy, which means torture, show trial, and execution. We will deny all knowledge of you. You will die alone in a Soviet cell, and no one will know or care." Klaus nodded. He had made his choice. On April 12, 1947, Klaus crossed into the Soviet occupation zone near the town of Hof, carrying forged papers identifying him as Klaus Bauer, a displaced person from Silesia seeking factory work. He wore shabby civilian clothes, carried a battered suitcase containing nothing incriminating, and felt utterly exposed. The Soviet checkpoint guards barely glanced at his papers. Germany was full of displaced persons, millions of refugees fleeing east to west, west to east, searching for lost families or simply survival. One more did not matter. As Klaus walked into Soviet-controlled territory, he experienced a strange sensation of completion. He had been captured by the Soviets as a soldier, held in their camps, tortured by their brutality. Now, he was returning as a spy, carrying American secrets, preparing to strike back. It felt like justice, revenge. Perhaps they were the same thing. He found lodging in a workers' boarding house in Erfurt, got a job at a textile factory, and began his work. By day, he operated textile machines. By night, he observed, documented and memorized Soviet troop movements, security procedures, names of local collaborators and resistors. Every 2 weeks, he traveled to Berlin using his factory worker credentials and passed his intelligence to an American contact, a man named Schmidt, who ran a bakery in the western sector. The winter of 1947 descended on Erfurt with particular cruelty. Bringing temperatures that froze the Gera River solid, and turned the already gray industrial city into a monochrome prison. Klaus Becker, or rather, Klaus Bauer, as his forged papers identified him, huddled in his unheated room at the workers' boarding house on Magdeburger Allee, writing coded reports by candlelight. The electricity had been cut again, the third time that week. Everything in the Soviet zone was rationed, controlled, monitored. He had been operating in East Germany for 8 months now, and the work had settled into a dangerous routine. By day, he worked 12-hour shifts at the Ernst Thälmann textile factory, operating looms alongside 200 other workers, mostly women, since the war had killed or imprisoned most of the men. The factory produced uniforms for Soviet forces, and Klaus carefully noted production numbers, shipment schedules, and the occasional presence of Soviet officers inspecting quality. By night, he cultivated sources. This was the real work, the work Morrison had trained him for. Intelligence was not stolen, it was given, traded, coaxed from people who had their own reasons for betraying the system crushing them. His most valuable source was a woman named Greta Zimmermann, a clerk in the local Soviet administrative office. She was 43, a widow whose husband had died at Stalingrad, bitter about the Soviets who occupied her city while preaching liberation. Klaus had met her at the factory canteen, where she ate lunch because the food was marginally better than what rations provided. Their relationship was purely professional, though Klaus suspected the Soviets would not see it that way if discovered. Once a week, Greta passed him carbon copies of documents that crossed her desk troop deployment orders, supply requisitions, internal security memos. She never asked what he did with them. He never told her about the Americans. They both understood that ignorance was protection. The information Klaus gathered was methodically encoded using a simple but effective substitution cipher, written on cigarette papers and concealed inside a hollowed-out chess piece he carried every 2 weeks. He boarded the early morning train to Berlin, a journey of 3 hours, through devastated countryside, ostensibly, to visit his fictional sister in the Prenzlauer Berg district. Berlin was divided now, carved into 4 sectors like a cake, though the divisions were becoming increasingly hostile. The Soviet sector dominated the east, while American, British, and French sectors controlled the west. Klaus's contact point was in the American sector, in a bakery on Kantstraße operated by an actual German baker named Johann Schmidt, who also happened to work for American intelligence. The routine never varied. Klaus entered the bakery, purchased 2 rolls using a specific phrase, "Do you have any with caraway seeds?" And Schmidt would respond, "Not today. But check the DOD bin." In the DOD bin, Klaus would find a paper bag containing 3 rolls, and, hidden inside one, a hollow compartment where he deposited his chess piece. He would take the rolls, eat one, to maintain appearances, and return to Erfurt on the afternoon train. Simple, routine, deadly if compromised. In February of 1948, everything became more complicated. Soviet security services had intensified their counterintelligence operations. Klaus noticed increased surveillance at train stations, more document checks, more questions about travel purposes. The NKVD, now reorganizing into the MGB, was hunting spies, and they were getting better at it. During his February 23rd meeting at the bakery, Schmidt deviated from protocol. Instead of the usual exchange, he whispered quickly, "Your route is compromised. MGB arrested 2 of our people last week. Do not come back here. New contact point, Muller. Tobacco shop, Friedrichstraße, East Sector. Password, do you have Serbian tobacco? What? Wait 2 weeks before using it." Klaus's blood ran cold. Operating in the Soviet sector was exponentially more dangerous than in the American sector, but he nodded, pocketed the rolls, and left. The train ride back to Erfurt was interminable. Every Soviet soldier seemed to stare at him. Every passenger seemed suspicious. Klaus forced himself to remain calm, to read his newspaper, to appear as boring and unmemorable as possible. He survived the journey, but the close call reminded him how precarious his situation was. One mistake, one suspicious glance from the wrong person, and he would vanish into the Soviet system. No trial, no diplomatic protest, just disappearance. In March, Greta brought him information that made his blood run colder still. The Soviets were planning a major operation, something about blocking access to West Berlin. The details were vague, but the implications were clear. Stalin was preparing to test Western resolve. Klaus needed to get this information to his handlers immediately, but his next scheduled contact was not for 10 days. He made a dangerous decision, an emergency contact. Schmidt had given him a phone number to call only in absolute emergencies, a number that connected to the American military government in Munich. On March 18th, Klaus walked to the public telephone exchange in Erfurt city center. His hands trembled slightly as he fed coins into the slot and dialed the number. The call went through a complex routing system. Klaus could hear the clicks as it was transferred multiple times before a voice answered in German with a perfect Munich accent. "Granite," Klaus said quietly, using his operational codename. Priority information? Soviet operation planned against Berlin access? Timeline uncertain? Requires immediate handler contact. Understood. Maintain schedule. Do not call again. The line went dead. Klaus hung up, his heart pounding. He had broken protocol. Morrison would be furious. But the information was too important to delay. He walked back to his boarding house through streets still covered in rubble from the war, past buildings that would never be rebuilt, past people who shuffled through their lives with eyes downcast and spirits broken. The Soviet occupation had brought a different kind of destruction than bombs, a slow grinding down of hope, freedom, and human dignity. That night, lying in his narrow bed, Klaus thought about how far he had traveled from the man who had surrendered in Berlin's ruins 3 years earlier. He had been a soldier then, fighting for a cause he no longer believed in. Now he was a spy, fighting for what exactly? American interests? German freedom? Simple revenge against the Soviets who had brutalized him? Perhaps it was all three, or perhaps it no longer mattered. This was his life now, with shadows, danger, and the constant knowledge that discovery meant death. Outside his window, a Soviet patrol truck rumbled past, searchlights sweeping the darkened streets. Klaus closed his eyes and tried to sleep, knowing that tomorrow he would rise, go to the factory, work the looms, smile at his fellow workers, and continue his double life. The Cold War was beginning, though that term would not become common for several more years. Klaus Becker was on its front lines, and the battles here were fought not with tanks and artillery, but with whispered secrets and stolen documents. And this war, Klaus suspected, would last far longer than the one he had survived. On June 24, 1948, the Soviets made their move. Klaus Becker heard about it from Greta Zimmermann as they stood in the factory canteen, both pretending to complain about the quality of the ersatz coffee while she slipped him a folded document under the table. "Bye, wow, da 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 da." Greta whispered, Hera whispered, her voice tight with fear. "Roads, railways, canals, everything. Da 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 da. The western sectors are cut off. This is what you warned about." Klaus felt ice in his stomach. He had passed the intelligence about Soviet preparations, but clearly it had not been enough to prevent this. The blockade was a direct challenge to the Western powers. West Berlin, home to 2.5 million people in the American, British, and French sectors, was now an island deep in Soviet-controlled territory, completely isolated. The implications were staggering. Without ground access, West Berlin could not receive food, fuel, medicine, or supplies. The city would starve in weeks. Stalin was forcing the Western powers to either abandon Berlin or start a war to break the blockade. It was geopolitical brinkmanship of the most dangerous kind. Klaus needed to get to Berlin immediately. His handlers would need real-time intelligence on Soviet military deployments, civilian reactions, anything that could help the Americans decide their response. But travel to Berlin had just become infinitely more dangerous. The Soviets would be scrutinizing every person attempting to enter the city. He made his decision. That evening, he told his factory supervisor he needed emergency leave. His fictional sister in Berlin was ill. The supervisor, a committed communist named Hans Dietrich, who Klaus had always suspected of being an informer, studied him with suspicious eyes. "Travel to Berlin is restricted now," Dietrich said slowly. "Special permits are required." "My sister is dying," Klaus lied smoothly. "I must see her before... ... He let his voice break convincingly. Dietrich's expression softened. Slightly even committed communists understood family obligation. "I will authorize 3 days. But you must report to the Soviet commandant's office for travel papers." And Bauer, his voice hardened. "Do not make me regret this approval." Klaus obtained his travel papers the next morning after 2 hours of bureaucratic harassment at the Soviet commandant's office. The young Soviet lieutenant who processed his request spoke broken German and seemed more interested in extracting a bribe than in security. Klaus parted with a week's cigarette ration and received his papers. The train to Berlin on June 26 was nearly empty. Most Germans were avoiding the city now. Soviet soldiers were everywhere, checking papers at multiple points along the route. Klaus played his role perfectly. Worried brother, apolitical factory worker, no interest in politics, just trying to see his dying sister. Berlin was transformed. Soviet military presence had tripled. Checkpoints between east and west sectors were reinforced with additional guards, barbed wire, and searchlights. The atmosphere was tense, electric with the possibility of violence. Klaus made his way to the new contact point in the east sector, Muller's tobacco shop on Friedrichstraße. The shop was tiny, tucked between a ruined building and a butcher that had not had meat in weeks. Klaus entered, noting that the proprietor, a thin man of about 60, looked decidedly nervous.
Ow.
Klaus asked, using the password. Muller's eyes darted to the door, then back to Klaus. Not today. But if you come to the back room, I can check my reserve stock. In the back room, a man waited. Not Schmidt, not Morrison, but someone Klaus had not seen before, hard-faced American in civilian clothes, who radiated authority. I am Henderson, the man said in German, with a pronounced American accent. Your handler sent me. The situation is critical. We need intelligence on Soviet military readiness. Are they preparing for war? Or is this just pressure? Klaus spent the next hour debriefing Henderson on everything he had observed, the deployment patterns of Soviet units, the mood among Soviet officers, conversations Greta had overheard in the administrative offices. His assessment was that the Soviets were not preparing for war. They expected the Western powers to back down, to abandon Berlin rather than fight. They are wrong, Henderson said flatly. President Truman has authorized an airlift. We're going to supply West Berlin entirely by air. Every day, every hour, for as long as it takes. The Soviets think we will quit. They do not understand Americans. Klaus felt a surge of admiration mixed with disbelief. Supplying a city of 2.5 million people entirely by air? It seemed impossible, but Henderson's confidence was absolute. We need you to stay in place in Erfurt, Henderson continued. Monitor Soviet reactions as the airlift begins. Report any military buildups, any signs they might interfere with our aircraft. Can you do that? Klaus nodded. I can. Good. Because if this goes wrong, if shooting starts, we are looking at World War III. Your intelligence could make the difference between peace and nuclear war. The weight of that statement settled on Klaus's shoulders. Nuclear war. The Americans had used atomic bombs on Japan. The Soviets were reportedly developing their own. This crisis escalated. Klaus returned to Erfurt on June 28th. His fictional sister miraculously recovered. The airlift operation Vittles, as the Americans called it, began on June 26th. At first, it seemed inadequate. A few dozen transport planes carrying a few hundred tons of supplies. West Berlin needed thousands of tons daily just to survive. But the Americans and British were relentless. Increased flights, improved efficiency, established air corridors. Within weeks, planes were landing at Tempelhof Airport every few minutes around the clock. Klaus heard the drone of aircraft even in Erfurt, flying overhead on their approach paths to Berlin. Through summer and autumn of 1948, Klaus monitored Soviet reactions. Greta brought him reports of discussions in the Soviet administrative offices, frustration, anger, disbelief at Western determination. Some Soviet officers advocated shooting down the transport planes, but orders from Moscow were clear: do not start a war. The airlift continued through winter. On particularly cold days, Klaus would stand outside the factory during breaks and watch the silver specks of aircraft crossing the sky toward Berlin, lifelines of freedom cutting through communist airspace. The Soviet blockade finally ended on May 12, 1949, after 325 days. The Western powers had won through determination and logistics rather than violence. West Berlin had survived. The Soviets had blinked. Klaus stood in the factory canteen when the announcement came over the radio. Around him, workers reacted with mixed emotions, some relieved that tensions were easing. Others disappointed that the communists had failed to drive out the Western powers. That evening, Greta met him briefly outside the factory gates. "I am leaving," she said quietly. "Moving to the West. My brother has arranged papers. I cannot live here anymore. Not under these people." Klaus understood completely. "Go be safe." She pressed a final envelope into his hands, carbon copies of documents relating to the formation of a new East German state, separate from West Germany. "Your last gift from me. Use it well." She walked away into the twilight, and Klaus never saw her again. The blockade's end marked a turning point. Germany was officially dividing into two nations, the Federal Republic in the west, the Democratic Republic in the east. The temporary occupation was becoming permanent separation. Klaus's mission in Erfurt was ending. Henderson sent word through the contact network. Time to extract. Klaus had been in the Soviet zone for 2 years. He had gathered invaluable intelligence, survived multiple close calls, and contributed to the Western victory in the Berlin crisis. But extracting was not simple. The border between East and West was hardening daily. Soon it would be nearly impossible to cross. Klaus's escape would require everything he had learned. Every skill Morrison had taught him, and a considerable amount of luck. His journey back to the West, back to freedom, was about to begin. The morning of August 7th, 1949, Klaus Becker rose before dawn in his boarding house room in Erfurt for the last time. He had lived in this 12 by 15-foot space for nearly 2 years, and yet he felt no attachment to it. It had been a disguise, like everything else in his life, as Klaus Bauer. Today, that disguise would be discarded. The extraction plan Henderson had arranged was simple in concept, terrifying in execution. Klaus would travel to Berlin under the pretext of visiting his fictional sister, a cover story, worn thin from repeated use, but still functional. Once in Berlin, he would cross from the Soviet sector to the American sector at a predetermined point where American intelligence had compromised a Soviet guard. From there, he would be spirited back to West Germany. Simple, except that Soviet security had tightened considerably since the blockade ended. The MGB was actively hunting Western agents, and several networks had been rolled up in recent months. Klaus's name, his real name, might be on a list. Or it might not. There was no way to know. He packed his single battered suitcase with clothing and a few personal items that would support his cover. Hidden in a hollowed, book-worn copy of Goethe's Faust, which seemed appropriate, were his final intelligence reports. 2 years of observations, source networks, analyses. If he was captured, this material would convict him absolutely. The train to Berlin departed at 7:15. Klaus arrived at Erfurt Station at 6:40, allowing time for the inevitable document checks. A Soviet sergeant examined his travel papers with unusual thoroughness. "Purpose of visit to Berlin?" the sergeant asked in heavily accented German. "Visiting my sister? She has been ill." The lie rolled smoothly off Klaus's tongue. "How long will you stay?" 3 days, perhaps 4. The sergeant studied Klaus's face, comparing it to the photograph on his internal passport. Klaus kept his expression neutral, bored, slightly impatient, the demeanor of a man who had made this trip many times and found it routine. Finally, the sergeant returned the papers. Klaus boarded the train, found a seat in a crowded third-class compartment, and settled in for the 3-hour journey. Around him, Germans traveled on their own, business workers, mothers with children, a few Soviet soldiers on leave. Klaus read his newspaper and tried to appear unremarkable. The landscape rolling past the window was the Germany he had fought for, now divided and occupied. Fields still showed bomb craters from the war. Villages were half ruined. Occasionally they passed Soviet military installations, tank parks, airfields, barracks, symbols of occupation masquerading as liberation. Berlin appeared on the horizon around 10:30. The skyline still dominated by ruins despite for years of peace. The train pulled into Ospenhof in the Soviet sector, and Klaus disembarked with the crowd, moving with the flow toward the exit. Another document check. This time, a young MGB officer in the distinctive green-capped tabs of Soviet security services. He examined Klaus's papers with professional suspicion. Klaus Bauer, factory worker from Erfurt. The officer spoke perfect German. "You visit Berlin frequently. My sister lives here." She has been unwell. Klaus maintained eye contact, neither defiant nor submissive. What is your sister's name? Ingrid Bauer? The fictional sister had a complete backstory, an address in Prenzlauer Berg, even forged letters in Klaus's suitcase referencing her health problems. What illness does she suffer from? Tuberculosis. The doctors say open your suitcase. Klaus's heart rate increased marginally, but his hands remained steady as he opened the case. The officer rifled through clothing, picked up the Gerda, flipped through pages. Klaus held his breath. The officer examined the book carefully, felt its weight, noticed the hollowed interior. But the officer simply tossed it back in the suitcase. Proceed. Report to the local commandant's office within 24 hours. Klaus nodded, closed the suitcase, and walked away with measured steps. He did not run. He did not look back. He walked like a man with nothing to hide. The extraction point was in the Kreuzberg district, where the American and Soviet sectors met. Klaus took the U-Bahn, noting that Soviet soldiers were checking passengers at random. He was not stopped. By noon, he was walking through streets that straddled the sector boundary, American control on one side, Soviet on the other, though the demarcation was not yet physical, would come later in 1961 with concrete and barbed wire. For now, it was just paint marks on streets and different uniforms on different corners. The contact point was a cafe on Iranian Strage, right on the sector line. Klaus entered, ordered coffee that tasted almost real American supplies reaching the western sectors, and sat near the window. At precisely 12:30, a man in mechanic's overalls entered and sat at the adjacent table. The crossing point is 3 blocks south, the man said in German without looking at Klaus. Checkpoint Charlie. Guard station on the Soviet side. At 1300 hours, the guard will step away to urinate. You have 90 seconds. Walk. Do not run. Papers ready. American MPs will be expecting you. Password is granted. Understand? Klaus nodded once. The man stood and left. Klaus finished his coffee, noting the time, 12:45. 15 minutes. He paid for the coffee, collected his suitcase, and walked south on Iranian Strage. The sector boundary was marked here by white paint lines and competing flags. Soviet red on one side, American stars and stripes on the other. The guard station was a simple wooden structure manned by 2 Soviet soldiers. Klaus approached from the Soviet side, timing his arrival for exactly 1 o'clock. As promised, one guard suddenly stood and walked behind the structure. Klaus counted 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi. At 10 Mississippi, he started walking, not running. Walking with purpose, but no panic. The remaining Soviet guard glanced at him, then away, distracted by something. Klaus crossed the white line. American MPs materialized. Weapons raised. Halt. Papers. Granite, Klaus said clearly in German, then in English. Granite. The MPs relaxed marginally. One spoke into a radio. Within seconds, a jeep appeared with Major Morrison in the passenger seat. Morrison's hard face cracked into a rare smile. Welcome back to the West, Becker. Get in. Klaus climbed into the jeep, his legs suddenly weak as adrenaline drained away. Behind him, the Soviet guard returned to his station, noticed nothing amiss. They drove through West Berlin streets, past the Reichstag ruins, past Tempelhof, where transport planes still landed every few minutes, past civilians going about their business in relative freedom. Klaus said nothing, overwhelmed by the simple fact that he had survived. At the American military government headquarters, Henderson was waiting. Outstanding work, Agent Granite. Your intelligence during the blockade was invaluable. The president himself read some of your reports. Klaus barely registered the words. He was safe. After 2 years behind Soviet lines, constant danger, lies upon lies, he was finally safe. They debriefed him for 3 days, everything he had seen, everyone he had met, every piece of intelligence he had gathered. Then Morrison drove him to Pulak, to the familiar gates of the American intelligence facility where his journey had begun nearly 3 years earlier. Dieter Schultz and Werner Hoffman were there, both having completed their own missions in different parts of the Soviet zone. They embraced like brothers, 3 survivors of the Wehrmacht, who had become something else entirely. What now? Werner asked. At 22, the young man had aged decades now, Morrison said, overhearing. Now the real work begins. The Cold War is just starting. We need men like you, if you are willing. Klaus looked at his two comrades, then at Morrison. They were soldiers without an army, Germans without a unified country, men whose skills were suited only for shadows and secrets. We are willing, Klaus said. And so Klaus Becker, who had been captured by the Soviets as a Wehrmacht captain, imprisoned in Soviet camps, recruited by the Americans, and operated behind Soviet lines for 2 years, continued his unlikely journey. He would serve American intelligence for another 23 years. Operating across Europe during the Cold War's most dangerous decades, he never returned to Hamburg. The city he remembered no longer existed. Instead, he eventually settled in Munich, married a teacher named Helena in 1953, and raised 2 children who never knew the full truth of their father's past. When the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, Klaus was 69 years old. He stood in his Munich apartment, watching television coverage of Germans streaming through newly opened checkpoints, and wept. For Margarethe and the children he had lost, for the Germany that had been destroyed, for the Germany being reborn. Werner called that evening. Dieter had died 2 years earlier, quietly in his sleep. We did it, Klaus, Werner said, his voice thick with emotion. We helped win. Klaus was not certain about that. History was complicated. Cold War had been won by many people making many sacrifices. He had been only one small part of an enormous struggle, but he had survived, against all odds, through Soviet camps and American service, through lies and truths, through war and Cold War, he had survived. Klaus Becker died peacefully in 1998, at age 78, surrounded by his family. His obituary identified him as a retired civil servant.
Only
His family and a handful of former intelligence colleagues knew the truth. His story captured by the Soviets, then by the Americans. Then by history itself, remained classified until 2015 when age documents were finally released. It stands as testimony to one man's resilience, adaptability, and determination to find purpose amid the ruins of everything he had known. In the end, Klaus Becker was neither hero nor villain. He was simply a survivor who kept walking forward when standing still meant death, kept fighting even when the cause kept changing, who found meaning in service even when that service required betraying everything he had once believed. His story is one story among millions from that terrible century. But it is worth remembering, because it reminds us that history is made not just by presidents and generals, by ordinary men forced to make extraordinary choices in impossible circumstances. And sometimes, surviving is its own kind of victory.